All right, everybody, welcome to another deep dive with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, especially for this topic, because it's a tough one. Listeners wanted us to really dig into this recent NYPD subway shooting and all the fallout from it, and we knew we needed your expertise to do it justice.
I'm happy to dive in. It's definitely a situation that raises a lot of questions about policing, poverty, safety, the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely. And we're digging into a really thought-provoking piece by Natasha Leonard over at The Intercept. Have you seen this one?
Oh, yeah, her take is definitely generating some serious buzz online and offline.
For sure. So we're going to try to unpack it all for you all, help you cut through the noise and really understand what's at stake here. But before we even go there, I think it's crucial to make sure we're all on the same page about what actually happened at the Sutter Avenue station. Sometimes the facts can get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, agreed. Got to start with the basics.
So it seems this all went down when a man allegedly hopped the turnstile, skipped out on a $2.90 fare. Two officers spotted him and things escalated really quickly. A chase ensued up multiple flights of stairs, ending on the platform.
And then things took a turn for the worse, right?
Exactly. According to witnesses, the man brandished a knife, and that's when both officers drew their weapons and fired. The suspect was hit multiple times. Tragically, though, two bystanders and one of the officers were also injured in the crossfire.
And it's important to highlight just how serious this was, right?
Hmm.
Leonard's article really emphasizes that one of the bystanders was in critical condition with a head wound.
Absolutely. This wasn't just a minor incident. Now, Leonard doesn't see this shooting as an isolated event, does she?
Not at all.
Mm.
She argues that this incident is a direct consequence of Mayor Eric Adams's policies, specifically his push to increase police presence in the subways.
Right. And for our listeners who might not know Leonard's work, she's not just some random commentator. She's a contributing writer for The Intercept, and she's known for her really insightful writing on policing protests and something she refers to as state violence.
Which, for those who don't know, refers to how governments use force often disproportionately to maintain order, or I guess you could say suppress dissent.
Exactly. And what I find so interesting about Leonard's analysis is that she directly connects the shooting to these larger systemic issues. Like, she doesn't just stop at more cops on the subway. She argues that this approach of flooding the subway with armed police to address things like fare evasion or homelessness is almost guaranteed to lead to more situations where things can spiral out of control.
Yeah, like rather than diffusing tension, it's almost like this approach creates the very conditions for it to explode.
Precisely. And then Leonard takes it a step further by taking on the whole broken windows theory. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, it's the idea that cracking down on minor offenses like vandalism or fare evasion deters more serious crime.
Right. Like, if you keep things orderly, the thinking goes people will be less likely to commit major crimes.
Exactly. But Leonard challenges that whole premise. She cites studies that show it doesn't actually improve public safety. And actually, she argues that constantly confronting people for low-level offenses can actually make communities less safe.
How so?
Well, it creates this adversarial us versus them dynamic between law enforcement and the people they're supposed to be serving. And that makes it even harder to address the root causes of crime because there's no trust.
That makes sense. So if more police and tougher penalties aren't the answer, what does Leonard propose?
She argues for a complete 180. Instead of more law enforcement, she wants to see more investment in social services, things that address the underlying issues that contribute to poverty and crime.
So things like affordable housing, mental health resources, job
Yeah,
training.
exactly. All those things that can help people get back on their feet and create a more stable life for themselves.
So instead of basically criminalizing poverty, you address the conditions that lead to it in the first place.
Right. And to drive home just how costly the current system is, Leonard throws out some pretty hard-hitting statistics.
Yeah, those numbers are pretty startling. For example, she points out that overtime pay for subway police has skyrocketed from just $4 million in 2022 to a whopping $155 million in 2023.
Yeah, that's a massive increase. Think about how far that money could go if it were invested in those social programs we were just talking about.
Right, it's like pouring money into a leaky bucket instead of just fixing the leak in the first place. And then there are the human costs. Leonard points out that there have been 1,700 arrests and a staggering 28,000 tickets issued this year alone, just for fare evasion.
Wow. And when you consider that nearly a third of low-income New Yorkers struggle to afford the fare, it makes you wonder if we're really prioritizing fairness and justice here, or just punishing people for being poor.
It does make you think. And Leonard doesn't stop there. She goes on to say that NYPD misconduct settlements have cost the city over $500 million in the past 6 years alone. So on top of everything else, there's this massive financial burden attached to these tactics.
Yeah, it really begs the question, what if we redirected even a fraction of those funds? What kind of impact did we have? Could we actually prevent some of these tragedies from happening in the first place?
It's definitely a lot to unpack. We've got this law and order approach going head to head with a more compassionate and some might argue more logical approach that takes into account the social and economic realities people face.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole other layer to this. Leonard's article isn't just about critiquing specific tactics. It's about questioning the entire system and the assumptions behind it. But we'll dive into all of that right after a quick break.
So we've talked about the shooting itself and Leonard's critique of that broken windows approach, but I feel like there's another layer here, don't you?
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting. Because Leonard isn't just critiquing specific policing tactics. She's going deeper. She's starting to question some of the fundamental beliefs we have about poverty and crime, like the underlying assumptions that shape our responses to these issues.
Like, what if our whole approach is off?
Exactly. She even kind of hints at this idea that there are powerful interests that benefit from the status quo, that the system, as flawed as it is, serves them somehow.
You mean like there are people who actually want to keep things the way they are, even if it's not working for everyone?
It's complicated, but that's the thread she seems to be pulling at. Like, think about it. Who profits from mass incarceration? Who benefits when poverty and crime are seen as individual failings rather than systemic issues?
Wow. So it's not just about good intentions or lack of ideas. We're talking about entrenched power dynamics that make it really hard to change course, even when the evidence suggests we should.
Exactly. And Leonard ties this to a bigger point about the role of police in society in general. Are they there primarily to enforce the law no matter the cost? Or are they supposed to be contributing to a safer, more just society overall? It's such a fundamental question, but we rarely stop to ask it.
So if we really sit with that question for a minute, it's like Leonard is pushing us to rethink the very definition of public safety. Like, is it just about the absence of crime? Or does it also mean addressing the root causes the inequality that might lead someone to commit a crime in the first place?
Exactly. And this is where Leonard's argument gets really thought-provoking. She suggests that there might be deeper, less obvious reasons why we keep throwing more law enforcement at these problems. Reasons that go beyond just wanting safe streets.
You mean like there are other agendas at play?
It's possible.
Yeah.
Right. Leonard points to the political and economic incentives baked into the system as it is. For example, certain policies might sound tough on crime and play well with voters even if they don't actually address the root causes of the problems.
So it's more about winning elections than actually solving problems?
In some cases, it seems that way. And then there's the economic side of things. Think about the industries that profit from the current system. The private prisons, the surveillance technology companies, and of course the politicians whose careers are built on promises of law and order. It's a whole web of interconnected interests.
So for you, the listener out there, this isn't just about one shooting on one subway platform. This is about starting to question the deeper narratives we've been told about crime and poverty and the role of law enforcement in our society. What if we've been looking at this whole thing through the wrong lens this whole time?
And that's the challenge Leonard is putting forth. It's about recognizing that there are often multiple perspectives at play, and we need to be willing to ask ourselves, why is this particular solution being pushed so hard? Who benefits from it? Are there alternative approaches that might actually be more effective and more just?
Because if we don't start asking those tough questions, we're just going to keep getting the same results.
Exactly. It's about being willing to challenge our assumptions, to look beyond the surface, and to be open to the possibility that there might be better ways of doing things. And that's where the real work begins. But we'll get into that more after a quick break.
All right, so we've really gone deep on this issue. We've examined the subway shooting, unpacked Leonard's arguments, and even questioned some of those bigger assumptions we often have about policing poverty, all of it.
It's a lot to absorb, for sure.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the whole point of these deep dives, isn't it? To give you the tools to look at these complicated issues with fresh eyes.
Exactly. So now let's shift gears a bit and bring it back to you, the listener. What's resonating with you after hearing all of this?
I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. But if there's one thing I hope people take away from this, it's the importance of asking those critical questions, especially in your own communities.
Exactly. How do you feel about that balance between keeping people safe and respecting individual rights, especially in public spaces? Is that tension something you see playing out where you live?
And if you do see it, what are the alternatives? Are people talking about solutions? Because change often starts at the local level. Having these conversations in our own backyards is so important.
100%. And remember, this deep dive is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Leonard's article gives us a lot to think about, but she's just one voice among many.
Exactly. Don't stop here. Keep asking questions, keep digging, and keep those critical conversations going.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to leave everyone with one final question, something to really chew on. We talked about how simply increasing police presence might not be the answer, but what are the alternatives?
It's tough, right? There aren't any easy solutions.
Yeah.
But that's precisely why we need to be talking about this. What are those concrete steps we can take to address fare evasion, but do it in a way that also supports low-income residents?
Right. Like, what if we explored ideas like fare-free transit or maybe basic income programs? I know those might seem radical to some, but could they actually be more effective, more just in the long run?
Exactly. It's about shifting our mindset away from just punishing people towards actually trying to solve the root problems, moving from reaction to creation.
Those are some heavy ideas to leave you all with. But hey, that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Getting you thinking differently, even inspiring you to take action, whatever that looks like for you.
Don't forget, knowledge is power, and it's meant to be shared. So keep those conversations going. Challenge the status quo, and never stop asking those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a really critical issue. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those minds open.